Have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary, but later discovered they had an extraordinary dream? Many people believe that success belongs only to the smartest students. Some think you need a rich family, an expensive school, or perfect grades. But the truth is much simpler. Success often belongs to the person who never stops learning. This is the story of a boy who proved exactly that. My name is Noah Walker. I grew up in a quiet village surrounded by green hills and wide fields. Life there was simple. Most families worked on farms. Some owned small shops. Others repaired bicycles or sold vegetables at the local market. My parents were honest, hard-working people. My father fixed old bicycles. My mother baked bread and sold it every morning. We never had much money, but we always had enough to eat. When I was 10 years old, I asked my father, "Dad, why don't we have a big house like the people in the city?" He smiled as he tightened the wheel of an old bicycle. "A big house doesn't make a big life, Noah." "What makes a big life?" He looked at me and said, "Keep learning, and one day you'll discover the answer yourself." At that time, I didn't fully understand his words, but I never forgot them. School was difficult for me. I wasn't the fastest student. I wasn't the best at mathematics. Sometimes I forgot my homework. Sometimes I answered questions incorrectly. But there was one thing that made me different. I was curious. If I learned one new word, I wanted to learn 5 more. If I read one page, I wanted to read another chapter. Every question led to another question. My favorite place in the village wasn't the playground. It wasn't the river. It wasn't even my home. It was a tiny library beside the old church. The building was small. The roof leaked when it rained. The shelves were old. Many books had torn covers. But to me, it was the most wonderful place in the world. The librarian was an elderly woman named Mrs. Grace. She had kind eyes and a warm smile. Every Saturday morning, she welcomed me with the same words. "Good morning, Noah. What adventure are you looking for today?" Sometimes I borrowed books about animals, sometimes about history, sometimes about inventions, sometimes about people who changed the world. One afternoon, Mrs. Grace noticed something. "Noah?" "Yes?" "You never borrow the same kind of book twice." I smiled. "Because the world has too many things to learn." She laughed softly. "I believe you'll go far one day." I shook my head. "I'm just a village boy." She closed the book she was holding. "Never use the word just. You're never just anything. You're becoming someone." Those words stayed with me. As the years passed, my love of learning continued to grow. But life wasn't always easy. When I turned 14, my father became ill. He could no longer repair bicycles every day. Our family's income became smaller. One evening, I heard my parents talking quietly. "We may have to stop Noah's schooling," my mother whispered. "We can't afford the books anymore." I stood outside the door, listening. My heart felt heavy. The next morning, I made a decision. After school, I began working at the village market. I carried heavy boxes. I cleaned stalls. I helped customers carry their bags. The work was tiring. By the time I reached home each evening, my hands were sore. But before going to bed, I always opened a book, even if I could read only 2 pages. Mrs. Grace noticed that I looked exhausted. One Saturday, she asked, "Are you sleeping enough?" I smiled. "Not really." She looked worried. "Then why do you keep studying so late?" I answered without thinking. Because every page I read is one step closer to the life I dream about. A minute later, she returned with a small wooden box. Inside was an old fountain pen. "This belonged to my husband," she said. "He was a teacher for 40 years. He believed that knowledge is the one treasure nobody can steal." She placed the pen in my hand. "I want you to have it." I was surprised. I can't accept something so valuable. She smiled. "Promise me one thing." "What?" "Use this pen to write your future." I held the pen carefully. "I promise." A few weeks later, our school announced exciting news. The best student in the district would receive a full scholarship to one of the country's finest schools. The scholarship would pay for everything: books, uniforms, housing, education. For students like me, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. My classmates immediately began preparing. Some hired private tutors. Others attended expensive classes after school. I couldn't afford any of those things. All I had was my determination. As I walked home that afternoon, I looked at the old fountain pen in my pocket. I whispered to myself, "This is my chance." But deep inside, I knew that winning the scholarship would be the greatest challenge of my life. The announcement about the scholarship spread quickly through the school. Every student was talking about it. "The exam will be very difficult," one boy said. "Only the smartest student will win," another replied. I listened quietly. Deep inside, I wondered if I really had a chance. That afternoon, Mrs. Grace saw me sitting alone in the library. "You look worried, Noah." "I am." She sat beside me. "Tell me what's on your mind." I looked down at the old fountain pen she had given me. "What if I'm not smart enough?" She smiled kindly. "Can I ask you a question?" I nodded. "If 2 people walk toward the same mountain, who reaches the top first?" "The faster one," I answered. She gently shook her head. "No, the one who refuses to stop walking." Her words stayed in my mind. From that day, I created a study plan. I woke up at 5 o'clock every morning. Before school, I reviewed mathematics for 1 hour. During lunch, I practiced English vocabulary. After school, I worked at the village market until evening. When I arrived home, I helped my mother prepare dinner. Then, I studied again before going to bed. Some nights, I was so tired that I almost fell asleep on my books. But I remembered my father's words: "Keep learning, and one day you'll discover the answer yourself." Those words gave me strength. One afternoon, while I was reading a science book in the library, a classmate named Ryan walked in. Ryan was one of the smartest students in school. His family was wealthy. He attended private tutoring every weekend. He looked at the pile of books on my table. "You're studying again?" "Yes." He laughed. "You really think you can beat everyone?" I smiled politely. I'm not trying to beat everyone. I'm trying to become better than I was yesterday. Ryan shook his head. You'll never win. The scholarship is for students with talent. Then he walked away. His words hurt. For a moment, I almost believed him. That evening, I told my father what had happened. He listened quietly. Then he carried 2 small seeds from the garden. He placed them in my hand. What do you see? Seeds. Do they look the same? Yes, he nodded. But one may become a giant tree. The other may not grow at all. I looked confused. Why? Because what matters isn't what the seed looks like. It's how well it's cared for. Then he smiled. Your talent is only a seed. Your habits decide what it becomes. The next morning, I stopped worrying about Ryan. Instead, I focused on improving a little every day. Mrs. Grace began giving me extra books to read. My mathematics teacher stayed after school to explain difficult lessons. Even the village baker helped me. Every morning, he gave me yesterday's bread for free. You need food for your brain, he said with a smile. Little by little, the whole village began supporting me. One Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Grace handed me an old newspaper. On the front page was a photograph of a famous scientist. Do you know his story? She asked. I shook my head. He failed many exams when he was young. He was told he wasn't intelligent enough, but he never stopped learning. She closed the newspaper. People often admire success. They rarely see the years of quiet effort behind it. That sentence became my favorite quote. As the weeks passed, I noticed something surprising. Studying no longer felt like a burden. It became something I truly loved. Every new word, every solved problem, every chapter I finished made me feel stronger. The scholarship was no longer my only goal. Learning itself had become the reward. Finally, the day of the examination arrived. Students from schools across the district gathered in one large hall. More than 200 students filled the room. Some looked nervous. Others looked confident. I quietly took my seat near the back. The examiner walked onto the stage. He smiled and said, "Today's exam is not designed to find the student who has memorized the most facts. It's designed to find the student who knows how to think." Those words immediately reminded me of Mrs. Grace. Learning wasn't about remembering everything. It was about understanding. The exam papers were placed on every desk. My hands trembled slightly as I looked at the first page. I whispered a silent prayer. Then I picked up the old fountain pen, the same pen Mrs. Grace had trusted me with. I smiled. No matter what happens today, I thought, I've already become someone my younger self would be proud of. The examiner looked around the room. You may begin. I turned over the first page, and my heart nearly stopped. The very first question was unlike anything I had ever studied before. I stared at the first question. It was not a mathematics problem. It was not an English grammar exercise. It was a simple sentence. Describe a problem in your community and explain how you would solve it. I blinked. I had expected difficult formulas, long vocabulary lists, history dates. Instead, The exam asked me to think. For a moment, I smiled. Mrs. Grace had been right. Learning was not about memorizing. It was about understanding the world. I took a deep breath and began writing. I wrote about my village library. I explained that many children wanted to read, but there were not enough books. I shared my dream of creating a reading club where older students could help younger children learn. I wrote about how knowledge grows when people share it. Then I answered the rest of the questions. Some were difficult. Some were easy. When the examiner finally said, "Time is over," I put down my pen. I didn't know if I had passed, but I knew I had done my best. That evening, I returned to the library. Mrs. Grace was arranging books on the shelves. "How was the exam?" she asked. "I don't know." She smiled. That's an honest answer. I answered every question, but I made a few mistakes. Mrs. Grace nodded. Making mistakes doesn't mean you failed. It means you were brave enough to try. A week passed, then another. Every day, students wondered when the results would be announced. Finally, the principal stood in front of the whole school. He held a single envelope. Everyone became silent. The winner of this year's scholarship, he paused, is Noah Walker. For a second, I couldn't move. I looked around to make sure I had heard correctly. My classmates began clapping. My teachers smiled proudly. Mrs. Grace stood at the back of the crowd. She quietly wiped away a tear. I walked to the stage with shaking hands. The principal handed me a certificate. "You earned this," he said. "No," I replied softly. "So many people helped me earn it." When I returned home, my parents were waiting outside. My father hugged me tightly. "I always believed in you." My mother smiled through her tears. "We're so proud of you." A few days later, I packed my small suitcase. Inside, I placed a few clothes, my favorite books, and the old fountain pen. Before leaving, I visited the library one last time. Mrs. Grace handed me a wrapped package. "Open it when you arrive at your new school." I thanked her and promised to visit whenever I could. Life at the new school was very different. The classrooms were larger. The library was filled with thousands of books. Students came from many cities. At first, I felt nervous. Everyone seemed smarter than me. One evening, I almost gave up. "I don't belong here," I whispered. Then I remembered my father's words, "Keep learning." So I studied. I asked questions. I read more books. I listened carefully. Little by little, my confidence grew. I wasn't the smartest student, but I became one of the hardest working. Years passed. I graduated with honors. Later, I became an engineer. I helped design schools and libraries in small towns. Every building reminded me of the little library where my journey had begun. One afternoon, many years later, I returned to my village. The library looked older than ever. The roof still leaked when it rained. The walls needed fresh paint. Mrs. Grace was now retired. She smiled when she saw me. "I knew you'd come back." I hugged her. "You changed my life." She shook her head. "No, Noah. You changed your own life. I only opened the door." The next morning, I called the village leaders together. I want to build a new library, a place where every child can discover the joy of learning. Construction began a few months later. When the building was finished, it became the largest library in the district. Children filled every table. Books covered every shelf. Laughter echoed through the rooms. On opening day, I gave a short speech. When I was a boy, I believed education was about getting good grades. But I learned something much more important. Learning is not about being better than other people. It's about becoming a better version of yourself. The audience applauded. Then I reached into my pocket. I took out the old fountain pen, the same pen Mrs. Grace had given me years ago. I held it up and smiled. This pen never made me successful, but it reminded me that someone believed in me. And sometimes, one person who believes in you is enough to change your entire future. Mrs. Grace smiled with tears in her eyes. The children looked at the pen with curiosity. I placed it inside a glass display case at the entrance of the library. Beside it was a small sign. It read, "Never stop learning, because every page you read can become a new chapter in your life." As I watched the children choose their first books, I realized something. The greatest achievement was never winning the scholarship. It was inspiring others to believe in themselves. Because knowledge grows when it is shared. Dreams grow when they are protected. And success begins the moment you decide. Never stop learning. Thank you for listening. If this story inspired you, please like this video, share it with someone who loves learning, and subscribe to Fluent English Hub for more original English stories with meaningful life lessons. And always remember, the smartest person is not the one who knows the most. The smartest person is the one who never stops learning.